Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Omer Bartov. He is Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. And today we're going to talk about what's happening or what's happened in Gaza, whether it's a genocide or not. We're going to go through the evidence, the arguments, and we're going to discuss the statement put publicly by the International Association of Genocide Scholars back in late August. We're going to talk about all of that. So, Dr. Bartov, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Obrigado. Bom dia.
Actually, it's boa tarde here in Portugal.
Boa tarde.
So, just before we get into the conflict in Gaza, when and how did people create the definition of genocide?
So in the 1930s, there was a Polish Jewish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin who became increasingly concerned with a crime that had no clear definition. What he was thinking about was what happened to the Armenians in World War I when the Ottoman Empire murdered hundreds of thousands of Armenians. And he tried to think of how do you define this attempt to destroy a group, not simply kill large numbers of people, but destroy a particular group, a national group. In World War II, Lemkin had to flee from Poland because he was Jewish. Most of his family was murdered. He ended up in the United States, and he wrote a book, an important book about the Nazi occupation of Europe. And in that book, there's a chapter in which he proposes the term genocide, which he coined. It's his term. It's a combination of Greek and Latin to mean the destruction of a group. And after World War II, he worked really hard to have that term adopted by the newly established United Nations. And in 1948, the United Nations adopted a genocide resolution, a genocide convention, which by 1951 had been signed by a sufficient number of states and became international law. And that definition is a peculiar definition of a crime because it's the only one that exists in international law after 1945 that is about a crime against groups rather than against individuals. So this was an initiative, if you like, by Lemkin, which of course was gained a great deal of support as a consequence of the Nazi crimes in World War II.
And so, what are the main criteria or the criteria used to classify violence against a group of people as genocide?
So the genocide definition, which is the only definition, the definition in the convention is the only definition that matters in international law, says that genocide are acts carried out with the intent to destroy a particular group. It could be a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part as such. And then it enumerates certain types of actions. Those would be killing members of the group. They could be causing serious mental and physical harm to members of the group. It could be creating conditions that would be conducive to destroying the group in whole or in part. It could be preventing births in the group, or it could be taking away children from that group. Those are the 5 types of actions. So what is important in the definition is to identify that there is an intent to destroy the group as a group, and that intent is being implemented. These are the 2 major elements in the definition.
And if I understand it correctly, the destruction in part or whole of a particular group can also include the destruction of that group's cultural heritage, right?
Yes. So Lemkin, when he was trying to come up with that definition, spoke a great deal about what we would call now cultural genocide. That is not, as such, part of the UN definition.
Okay.
Where it appears is in the two last of the 5 types of actions, in the last 2, that is of preventing birth in the group and of taking children away from the group, because the understanding is that you can take children away, you don't have to kill them, you just raise them in another culture, and therefore the future of that group is determined to no longer exist.
So I would also like to ask you, because in this particular conflict in Gaza, many people have brought up also the concept of ethnic cleansing, and some people make the claim that what's been going on is not genocide, it's ethnic cleansing, and I think it's important to establish the difference here. So what is the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide?
So the first thing we need to understand is that while genocide has a particular convention in the UN, there is no accepted definition of ethnic cleansing in international law. It comes usually under forcible displacement. So the ethnic element is missing there. Forcible displacement is a war crime, can be a crime against humanity, and can be a genocidal crime if it's under the overriding intent of destroying the group in whole or in part. But the way ethnic cleansing is understood, and the way it was defined by the ICTY, the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, is that it's the attempt by one ethnic group to remove another ethnic group from a territory that the first ethnic group wants for itself. Usually, that entails a great deal of violence because people don't want to leave their homes and their lands. Whereas genocide is the attempt to destroy a group in whole or in part. So it may include taking over its territory, but the intent is the destruction of the group and not simply the territory. Historically, you could say that most cases of genocide began as ethnic cleansing. So that ethnic cleansing can be a pathway toward genocide. The goal may be to remove the group, but for many reasons, it becomes impossible to remove the group, and therefore the group is targeted for murder. And that happened in the German genocide of the Herero already in 1904, that happened in the Armenian genocide in 1915. And in fact, the Holocaust also begins as an attempt by the Nazi authorities to get rid of Jews, to just move them out of German controlled areas. But there's increasingly, as Germany expands, it comes to control more larger and larger Jewish populations and has fewer and fewer options to remove them, and therefore they choose to murder them.
So I've heard from many people that one of the most difficult aspects of genocide to prove has to do with the intent to commit genocide. How can intent be proven when it comes to genocide? What sources of evidence can we look into?
So there are 2 ways of determining intent. One is if the genocidal authority, state, organization say that they're doing it, that they want to do it. They say, we want to carry out genocide against this group. Now that rarely happens because génocidaires usually dress what they're doing under something else. They say we have no choice. They say they're inhuman. They say they're the enemy from within. They say it's a war, it's not a genocide, and so forth. They're partisans. There are all kinds of ways of euphemisms that will not entail the word genocide. And leaders often don't want to have that in writing. But that's the easiest way to determine that at least there's a genocidal intent. The second is to look at the pattern of operations. And the ICJ, the International Criminal Court of Justice, has included discerning a pattern of operations as one way of saying that genocide is occurring, that if you see that there are clear attempts by a state to destroy another group, and you see that being implemented on the ground, that can serve as evidence. What the ICJ has suggested is that you have to show that this is the only explanation you can have for those actions, that there's no reasonable alternative explanation for why the state is doing what it is doing, but an attempt to destroy the group in whole or in part as such.
As I said at the beginning, in late August, the International Association of Genocide Scholars put forth a statement and declared publicly that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. What led people from that association to make such a statement? I mean, on what basis did they argue that?
Well, I don't know what made them decide that, because I'm not a member of that organization. But by the time they made that statement, there was already a wide consensus among genocide scholars and experts in international law. So I wrote about that, not for the second time, but it was in the New York Times, so it got more coverage. In mid-July 2025. And what I argued by then was that there was overwhelming evidence that what Israel was carrying out was genocide. And the organization you mentioned cites many of the same reasons. That is, that there had been statements made by Israeli political and military leaders in the immediate aftermath of October 7th that had a genocidal content. There was talk about they will have no food, they will have no water, they will have no power, they're human animals and will be treated as such. There are no uninvolved people. Remember what Amalek did unto you. That is the injunction by the Bible, which is that Amalek has to be entirely destroyed. That's a biblical people that attacked the Israelites. The question was whether these are statements made in the heat of the moment, or they actually were evidence that this would unfold. And Israel also made other statements, and it said that its goal in the war was to destroy Hamas and release the hostages, and that appeared reasonable at the time, considering the attack by Hamas that killed 800 civilians and took 250 hostages. So I sort of already wrote about that in November of 2023, and by then my impression was that the IDF was already engaged in war crimes and crimes against humanity because of the vast number of people who had already died. About 10,000 people had been killed by then. The majority of them civilians. And I warned that this might become genocide. But my view was that that it was undeniable that this was genocide by May of 2024. This was really the point at which it appeared that the pattern of operations conformed to the statements that were made in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, and that the goal was to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population.
Okay, so from or between November 2023 and May 2024, what was the kind of conduct from the IDF and from the Israeli government that made you become convinced that it was in fact a genocide? I mean, what else happened that made you convinced of that?
Yeah, it was actually the conduct from the very beginning. That is, from the moment that Israel launched a massive aerial attack, even before the ground troops entered, the destruction appeared initially to be indiscriminate. Later on, it appeared increasingly actually deliberate, not simply indiscriminate. And so what the evidence coming out showed that these actions were intended to remove the population from where it was living, increasingly push it southward toward the Egyptian border, and destroy everything that the population left under the guise of calling on the population to leave for its own safety, because those areas would become areas of operations. And what I could see by the summer of 2024 was that the destruction was not only of houses, infrastructure, but also of schools, of universities, of mosques, of museums, of archives, of everything that makes it possible for a population not only to live, but also to maintain its own culture, education, health, and sense of its identity. And so that even if it survived all this destruction, it would be very hard for it to reconstitute itself as a group.
So, for example, in late December 2023, and I'm referring to the still ongoing case that was brought before the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, by South Africa regarding Israel's conduct in the Gaza Strip. I mean, the case put forth was to declare it a genocide. Do you think that by then, December 2023, January 2024, there was still not enough evidence to declare it as such?
It was, look, I mean, the case presented by South Africa was very detailed and very convincing, and the case presented by Israel was not. But I was still hoping that this kind of action by South Africa would bring about action by the international community to stop Israel. My own sense was then, and remains now, that had the United States acted in November or December 2023, had President Biden at the time said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have to stop, and if not, you're on your own, which would have meant that Netanyahu would have stopped because he would not have had a choice, we might have said that this could have become genocide and it was stopped at the last moment, that there were war crimes, crimes against humanity, killing of large numbers of innocent civilians, but that it did not quite become genocide. And so I think it's between those, that time, between November, December of 2023 and the spring of 2024, that it became impossible to deny that that's what it was. As you know, the ICJ hasn't ruled yet. But the ICJ issued provisional measures, and those provisional measures indicated the possibility, the plausibility that there might be genocide. And Israel, again, did not abide by these provisions because the United States gave it political cover. Had it abided by them, had the United States forced it to do so, again, it might have not undone the vast damage that was already caused, but we might have said it was almost genocide, but it didn't quite happen.
So I would like to run through you some common arguments used to deny genocide in Gaza. Some of them have been used by the members of the Israeli government, others by Israeli spokespeople, others even by political pundits who deny genocide in Gaza, and some of them have been used by all of those people. So the first one is, people have said that if Israel wanted to commit genocide, they could have wiped out Gaza in a day or two. I mean, what do you make of that kind of argument?
Yeah, I must say that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, speaking on some podcasts, some right-wing podcasts in the US, said if we wanted to commit genocide, we would have done it in an afternoon. Now, how do you do genocide in an afternoon? You drop an atom bomb, right? That's the only way you can do it. What happens if you drop an atom bomb on Gaza City? Just imagine in a country the size of Israel, if you actually dropped a bomb on Gaza City, then nobody would be safe in Beersheba, in Ashkelon, in Ashdod, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Haifa. The radioactive pollution would be a catastrophe. So even if you were as crazy, and Netanyahu is not crazy, he is very extreme, but he's not insane. But even if you were insane to try and use a nuclear weapon that Israel has never admitted that it has, by the way, officially Israel never admitted that it has nuclear weapons, you would not be able to do it because you would be shooting yourself literally in the foot. But the argument is such that what is happening is not big enough. You have to think about it this way. By now, and now the genocide has ended, or at least is on pause. By now, almost the most conservative estimate of the number of people who died is close to 70,000. But it's likely much higher than that, up to 15,000 people buried under the ruins. Estimated 50,000 people who've died from indirect causes. That is under the Genocide Convention, as I said, creating conditions that would lead to the death of that group. So estimated 50,000 people. Well over 170,000 people wounded, many with life-changing injuries. So you're talking about over 250,000 people out of a population of 2 million who have been either killed or severely injured. And when you think about the children, who are half of the population of Gaza, who have long-term physical and mental damage because of those 2 years of genocide, then the numbers are vast. And in fact, they're bigger than in any conflict proportionate to the population since World War II. And so to minimize that and say, well, the numbers don't add up, it's not genocide, how many people do you need to kill? 200, 300, 500,000, all of them. These are insane arguments that show you in many ways the kind of dehumanization of Palestinians that is part of the whole problem.
Another claim I've heard is that, and this one is extremely common to hear, that Hamas uses civilians as human shields. And sometimes I also hear people adding to that claim and saying that, for example, if someone asks, and why were residential areas, why were schools, why were churches, why was cultural patrimony destroyed by the IDF? And then they add, that was because Hamas was using all of those infrastructures. So what do you make of that kind of claim?
Look, again, this is one of those arguments. First of all, Gaza, before the war, and I should say that we use the term war, but at least since June of 2024, it was not a war. It was an operation of demolition and destruction because there was no organized resistance anymore. But before October 7th, Gaza was one of the most densely populated places in the world. And Hamas was active there. Hamas is not a friendly organization. It's actually a murderous organization, tyrannical. It oppressed the people of Gaza as well. And thanks in large part to vast amounts of money provided to Hamas by Qatar through Israeli hands, at the support, in fact, the request of Benjamin Netanyahu, Hamas did build a vast underground chain of tunnels. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you operate against that? You could say that because Hamas could be everywhere, there might be a tunnel everywhere, there might be a Hamas operative anywhere, then the only way to destroy Hamas is to destroy Gaza. So the only way to accomplish the goal of destroying Hamas, not of releasing the hostages, but of destroying Hamas, is utter destruction. Or, if you like, how do you respond to the Hamas attack? By genocide, by complete destruction. The irony, of course, is that Israel failed in both destroying Hamas and in releasing the hostages through military operations. Hamas is still around, and Israel is still negotiating with Hamas, and the hostages were released only because of negotiations with Hamas and not through military action. But if you say that the only way to respond to what Hamas did is genocide, then you are trying to justify genocide. And genocide cannot be justified. Genocide is a crime. Whatever is the cause for doing it, genocide is a crime, and nothing justifies it. I have to add to this that although Hamas is not an organization that I would support, and I don't think it's done the Palestinians much good, if you want to resist an occupation, an oppression, the only way you can do it is through guerrilla methods. And as we know, and we can read Mao Zedong on this, the guerrilla has to be like a fish in the ocean. That is, you have to embed yourself within the civilian population. And in Gaza, there is no other place to operate from. So the other logic of this is that the population of Gaza must and had to always submit to Israeli occupation, oppression, and siege, because any resistance to that would mean that the IDF would have the right to entirely eradicate Gaza. And that is what the IDF tried to do. It succeeded in destroying almost all of Gaza, 90% of the schools, most of the universities, most of the hospitals, most of the mosques. So it succeeded in doing that. But I would say, and that's not exactly in response to your question, but it's an important thing to point out, that in many ways, Hamas succeeded in what it set out to do. It was at a very high price, an extraordinarily high price. And maybe some Hamas leaders would have hesitated had they known that the price would have been so high. But what it succeeded in doing is in putting the Palestinian issue back on the table, where it had entirely disappeared from, precisely because Netanyahu had managed to persuade the Israeli public and much of international world opinion that he could manage the Palestinian question, meaning that he could continue occupation, oppression, and creeping ethnic cleansing in the West Bank without having to face the consequences. And Hamas showed that that idea of managing the occupation was over and it can no longer happen.
So in your view, after October 7th, in what way do you think the Israeli government should have responded? What response would have been proportionate to the terrorist attack on October 7th, 2023?
So, we have to imagine a different government in order to think of what other alternatives there were. I would say that the government that was then in power and still is in power, incredibly, because most governments would have been swept away after the fiasco of October 7th, but still the same people are in power today as then, that government, after it recovered from the shock of the attack, 2-3 days later, saw that as an opportunity rather than a fiasco. And the opportunity was to implement what he wanted to do, that is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, and because he couldn't ethnically cleanse it, to create conditions that would be conducive to the destruction of that group. So for them, this was the only alternative. What other alternative would there have been? A different Israeli government could have said to the population of Gaza, look, you are under the rule of Hamas. Hamas are a murderous organization. They haven't done you much good. They certainly have not done us much good. They did a lot of good to Netanyahu and Smotrich, who saw them as an asset for their own policies, but for Israeli citizens, they were no good. Help us destroy Hamas. If you help us destroy Hamas, which is embedded in Gaza and which was not very popular by the time of the attack, we will promise you a different future. We will help you create a different Gaza. We will help you reunite with the West Bank, and will help you create a Palestinian entity that would not be under Israeli oppression. If Israel did that, it would have been able to destroy Hamas. And it would have been able to get support from large sectors of the Palestinian population, and there would have been much less of a rift within the Israeli population itself. But this government had no interest in doing that. In fact, that's the nightmare of those people, is to reunite the West Bank and Gaza and to provide a Palestinian authority, a legitimate, internationally recognized Palestinian authority for Gaza, which is why Netanyahu for years and years supported Hamas, knowing that Hamas was illegitimate in international political affairs.
So since that was not the approach taken by the Israeli government 2+ years ago, let me ask you about the ceasefire. So 2 questions about that. Do you think that at any point since the war, let's call it the war, but since the genocide started in Gaza, at any point there were good enough conditions for a ceasefire to be achieved? And in regards to the current ceasefire, do you think there's good enough evidence to say that it has been breached, and particularly by the Israeli government and the Israeli military forces, or not?
So first of all, there were many opportunities after October 7th. As I said, first of all, President Biden could have put an end to all this already a month or 2 into the Israeli campaign in Gaza. He could have forced Israel into it. He didn't want to do that. But in May 2024, just after the Israeli operation in Rafah, Biden presented a plan that he said both Netanyahu and Hamas had agreed to, which had all the elements that existed in the plan proposed in late September 2025 by Trump and signed by Netanyahu. It was basically the same plan, but he didn't put his foot down. And Netanyahu said, well, I actually didn't agree to that exactly, and we have to continue, and we won't give up the Philadelphia corridor. And he came up with all kinds of excuses. So throughout that period, and there was another, of course, there was a ceasefire, as you remember, in January of 2025 that Israel agreed to and received some of the hostages back. And then when it was supposed to move to phase 2, which was for the IDF to move increasingly out of Gaza, Netanyahu reneged on that. And the Israeli Air Force in March of 2025, in a few minutes, killed hundreds of civilians and broke the ceasefire. So generally speaking, Israel under Netanyahu sabotaged all attempts to bring about a ceasefire until this was forced for the second time by Trump, because Trump forced the one of January just as he came into office, and then again this October. However, I would say, look, when we speak about a ceasefire is obviously insufficient. A ceasefire is simply, it's good to have because the killing stops, or most of the killing stops. And the genocide right now is on pause. But it's not a political scenario. It doesn't provide any roadmap for the future. And that is what Netanyahu was especially against. He was against speaking about the next day. the day after, because the day after can only mean eventually bringing in Palestinian rule over Gaza, which is exactly what he does not want. Now, the current plan, this 20-point plan, which used to have 21 points, but 1 point was taken out, which had to do with no annexation of the West Bank. The 20-point plan very vaguely sketches a future. It sketches a political future. And that is a good thing. And I think that's the sort of nightmare for the Israeli government. And Netanyahu has repeatedly said that, well, it doesn't speak about a Palestinian state or anything of the sort, but it does. It actually has that in the 20 points. The question is whether it will be implemented. And in order for it to be implemented, there has to be strong focus and pressure by the United States, because Netanyahu will do everything in his power to sabotage it. And he's trying it over and over again. So yes, of course, Israel has breached ceasefire several times. There were also attacks by Hamas or by some operatives in the Gaza Strip. But Netanyahu is looking for any excuse to break the ceasefire. Now that the hostages are back, the live hostages are back, for him, he just needs an opportunity to move. And if Trump provides him with that space, it will happen. Israel will continue its operations in Gaza, which are demolition and ethnic cleansing and ultimate genocide. I think Trump right now does not want to let Netanyahu continue because Trump's interests are with the Arab Sunni states. And he has promised them that he would control Israel. But whether he would have the focus to continue pushing in that direction and to actually help change the entire political paradigm, which is the only way to stop this kind of ongoing and accelerating violence, I don't know. I'm skeptical.
So you said at a certain point there that the genocide is, at least for now, on pause. So at this point in time, and I want to say that we are recording this on October 31st, 2025. So at this point in time, do you think we can't talk about genocide as something that occurred in the past yet? I mean, it's something that can still be going on in the near future or not?
It certainly could. It certainly could. I mean, I'd say two things. First of all, it may well be resumed. And again, I say the greatest accomplishment of this 20-point plan was to stop the mass killing. And that's and Trump should take credit for that, because it was only because of him. I didn't vote for the man, and he's wrecking the United States. But this particular action stopped the mass killing. But it can resume, and it will resume if Trump takes his eyes off the ball. But I also want to say that even if it's not resumed, even if we could say, okay, now we have a different situation, we have to look back. We cannot say, as many people in Israel are trying to say right now, and many European politicians who also never wanted to say Israel is carrying out genocide, will say, okay, that's over, things are great now, let's look forward. Yes, we need to look forward. Yes, we need to provide a political paradigm, but we have to recognize that Israel had already carried out a genocide and that people have to be brought to account. As I said, the Genocide Convention is a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. There are people who are guilty of this. And if these people are not brought to justice, then this will happen again and again. And the main culprit here is Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I hope in the future, I don't know if I will live that long, but in the future, or that he will. But I hope in 5 years, in 10 years, whenever it happens, to see former Prime Minister Netanyahu in front of the court in The Hague. Because if that doesn't happen, then genocide will have won a great victory of being supported by the very states, Western states, Germany, France, Britain, and the United States. Those states that had pledged to protect the international law and human rights, that they supported and facilitated a genocide by Israel and never brought to account those who carried it out. That would be a catastrophe for the rule of international law and human rights.
Let me ask you about one of the stated goals with the operations in Gaza declared by the Israeli government, that was to eliminate Hamas. I mean, do you think that the actions by the Israeli government and the IDF during these past two plus years contributed in any way to eliminating Hamas?
Look, Hamas as a military organization was probably destroyed by January or February 2024. As I said, by the summer, you could no longer speak of a war. There are disparate guerrilla groups. You can always recruit youths in Gaza who are desperate and give them some guns, and they every once in a while can come out of a tunnel and fire an RPG rocket or sniper rifle. But as an organized military organization, Hamas was destroyed. As a political organization, deeply embedded in Gaza, of course, it hasn't been destroyed. It's still there. And it's now increasing its power again. It's trying to enforce its rule again. It's actually been executing its opponents, or all kind of gangs that the Israeli Secret Service had been supporting with guns. In this sort of long-term colonial Israeli policy of always supporting some other people against their main enemy. Israel is actually the main creator of Hamas in Gaza because it initially supported it against Fatah. So as such, it's still there. Now, I think that the only way that Hamas can be weakened is by providing a different political scenario. If there is a different political scenario that is supported by the surrounding Arab states, which want to see that, and is supported by Palestinians, by an alternative Palestinian leadership, and there is such a leadership, although it's mostly in jail right now, Hamas would be weakened. Hamas's hold on society would weaken. I don't think Hamas would ever disappear as such. It's a fundamentalist Islamic ideology, and you can't kill this ideology with guns. But you can weaken it if you provide people with another opportunity. And all opinion polls, even most recently, show that if you provide Palestinians, and for that matter, Israeli Jews, with a viable, feasible, reasonable, alternative political future, they will support it in large numbers. But as long as you don't, they will support the extremists on both sides. And that's the best indication you have that the only way to work against the extremists in Israeli politics, and I don't see any difference between Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Hamas. They have the same kind of ideology and the same kind of goals. The only way to weaken them is to provide political alternatives that will promise people a better future for themselves and their children.
So I want to ask you about how you look at the future of the Palestinian people. But just before that, what do you make of when people deny the existence? We hear this particularly from Zionist people, the existence of a Palestinian people. They deny that such group ever existed, that Palestine ever existed. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of it. You can deny all kinds of things. There are people who deny the right of Israel to exist too. There is a Palestinian people. There is an Israeli state. They exist, and we have to deal with it. and denying things is not a particularly good politics, whatever your direction is. It's true that in Israel, this is a long-term sort of narrative. In 1947, the UN offered a partition resolution, right? 29th of November, 1947, the UN recognized the need to separate mandatory Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. So an Arab state, had it come about, was already being recognized, and it would have been the state of the Palestinian people, of the Arab population of mandatory Palestine, of that part that would have ended up as being the Arab state. So that was already recognized by the UN in 1947. During the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, Israel recognized the Palestinian leadership, recognized the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. The flag of Palestine that is now being maligned throughout Europe and the United States, let alone in Israel, is a flag that Israel actually recognized during the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian flag. But yes, I remember Prime Minister Golda Meir coming to my high school in 1971 and saying there is no Palestinian people. So that's part of a long-term Israeli attempt to argue that the Arabs who live in the land of Israel, which has always been envisioned as eventually from the river to the sea, are transitory people. They don't really belong there. They don't have a group identity. The fact of the matter is that the very fact that Jews came to Palestine and settled it, that they brought with them a national ideology which was new. Zionism as a national ideology of Jews is only from the late 19th century. Jews also didn't see themselves as a nation. They were a people, but not a nation. That they brought that to Palestine. And one of the results of that was that the population there also developed its own national identity, which existed already in the 1930s. So to deny that is to live in a state of denial. And being in a state of denial is not the best way to conduct your politics. It will always lead you into delusion and errors, and in this case, into ongoing violence. One has to accept that there are two peoples living in that territory. There's a Jewish nation and a Palestinian nation. They have to find a way to share that space. There is none of them is going away. They're all staying there, and they have to find a way to live side by side. Denying each other's existence doesn't make the other side go away. It's just a solution. It's just a formula for more and more violence.
So I have one final question then also because I've noticed that we've already reaching the hour mark. So I wanted to ask you, looking at the current state of events, how likely do you think that a two-state solution will actually be implemented? And how do you look at the future of the Palestinian people?
So look, I mean, there are two ways of looking at this. The most likely scenario is a very unfortunate scenario. It is that Israel will be able to get away with some kind of version of what it had before, that it will impose a kind of rule in Gaza that would look somewhat like what it has in the West Bank. It will find some collaborating Palestinian agency that would do the dirty work for it. It will keep the right to go in and destroy and kill whenever it wants to. That is, it will create an apartheid system in Gaza, more brutal, but similar to the one in the West Bank, that it will continue the creeping ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, which is under the radar, but is happening on a daily basis. There's a huge amount of violence there. And that apartheid system will increasingly also creep into Israel, first apply to Palestinian citizens of Israel who are already being intimidated by the Israeli authorities, and then also be increasingly imposed on opponents, or Jewish opponents, of that regime. So it will become an authoritarian, racist, violent, increasingly militaristic, undemocratic state. As such, I don't think it could exist for very long, because I think it will lose the support of its European allies, of its American ally in the long run, and of Jewish communities around the world. It'll also be a major cause for anti-Semitism. Now, there is an alternative, and the alternative is something that I'm personally engaged in, and that is not exactly the old two-state plan, because I don't think that the old two-state plan is viable anymore. There are 650,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and you cannot remove them by force. Partly because it wouldn't even be legal or moral. There are several generations that were born there. It would be very difficult, partly because members of those settlers are well embedded in Israeli security agencies, in the legal system and so forth. They are in the Supreme Court, they're everywhere. So the old two-state solution, I think, is dead and gone. But what one can be created is a confederation. And that's the plan that I support. And I think that if that plan were explained, and if leaders of that plan were given the political space to try and implement that, that is actually a viable plan. And what it means, very briefly, is that there will be two states, and there will be more or less along the borders of 1967, and there will be sovereign states. Both groups have a right of self-determination and a right of return, so that all Palestinians who want to return could return to the state of Palestine, but that there would be a distinction between citizenship and residence, so that you could be a citizen of one country and reside in the other. The borders would be open borders, and there would be institutions of the Confederation that would control that. That would mean that you could be a Palestinian living in Lisbon who wants to go back to Palestine, and you could go there and become a Palestinian citizen. But if your family came from Haifa, you could apply for residence in Haifa, but you would vote for a Palestinian parliament. And if you're a Jewish settler living in the West Bank and decide that you want to stay in the state of Palestine, and I suspect the vast majority would not want to and would voluntarily leave, but if you decide you want to stay, you could stay as long as you abide by the laws of the state of Palestine, and you would vote for the Israeli Knesset and not for the Palestinian parliament. That's the general concept of a confederation that squares the circle of the fact that the whole land is so intermixed, the populations are so mixed that you cannot separate them. You can't separate the infrastructure and you can't separate the populations. So you have to find a way to have a plan that will enable them to live side by side equally and with equal dignity. In the long run, it might lead to a binational state. It might lead to a state of all its citizens, but it should start with giving sovereignty to both groups.
So, Dr. Bartov, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. I will be leaving links to your work in the description of the interview, including links to your fantastic books. People can learn about a lot about the links between war and genocide and the Holocaust through your books, which I found very interesting as well. And it's been a great discussion. So thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you, and I hope that my new book, Israel, What Went Wrong, will also come out in a Portuguese edition.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Leira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ignik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.